Las manos sirven para estrangular, escribir un poema, poner bombas, matar a otro, salvar a un inocente. Las manos sirven para todo menos para pensar. Con las manos puedes pescar un pez, atrapar un pájaro, tocar un cuerpo, pedir silencio, palparte tú. Las manos sirven para todo menos para soñar.
Kepa Murua is one of the great poets in the Spanish language of the last decades. Since that distant and perhaps premonitory Spartan in Honours, published in 1990, up to his most recent release, the monumental single poetry, Pure Premonition, from 2010, the Guipuzcoan poet has published nearly 20 books, practically all during the last decade. Throughout this fructiferous period, his writing on the edge and without concessions, Kepa Murua's radical commitment to modernity has given us titles such as I Always Counted to 10 and You Never Appeared, Digging the Earth with Your Dreams, A Place for Us, Cardio Slogans, and Poetry in You. A more tender and reflexive writing, but no less modern, arrived in 2008 with its Nothing, which displayed the constant searching and absolute freedom of this author, whom some branded as unclassifiable. We mustn't forget, in this short presentation, his applauded foray into essay, with his excellent works in collaboration with photographers, musicians and painters. Kepa Murua was born in 1962 and has lived for many years in Vitoria. Kepa, hello.
How are you?
Very well. The first thing I'd like to ask you before we start with the fervent present of 2010 is that we go back in time, even to before 1990, with the Spartan in Honours. This is a far-reaching exercise, so that you can tell us how you start writing, in which context, if you even remember that first poem, which every poet usually remembers.
I recall myself reading. I remember that at home, my father had a very varied but very interesting library, with books from Salvat, that collection of Nobel Prize winners, with authors such as Mikhail Sholokhov. It also had the complete works of Shakespeare. I remember reading, and inevitably the step into writing I think I took very naturally, without thinking too much about it. But I think that first I was a great reader, and I still am.
Cuando hablábamos de la influencia de algunos libros, pues eran los premios Nobel, que estos son libros de la biblioteca de mi padre, libros de Nobel de literatura, ¿no? Aquí, por ejemplo, está Sholokhov, que ya lo mencioné, casualidad, ¿no? La influencia de los rusos. También creo que mencioné libros de Kafka y de Rilke, ¿no? Aquí está, por ejemplo, Las cartas al padre, una primera edición que leí cuando era muy joven, ¿no? De Rilke, pues inevitablemente hay muchas cosas. Porque también los libros de arte, hay de todo un poquito, ¿no? Siempre conté hasta 10 y nunca apareciste. Fueron noches de granizo desnudo, de temblor en el humo del deseo, días de ayuno y lucidez.
There's a refrain in that book, Poetry, that's if it exists, which was in order to write poetry. Many of the entries in that book begin with that leitmotif. What is needed to write poetry?
To write poetry, you have to have a different vision, an awareness of time, and a radical commitment to that kind of writing, because it's a writing which takes you into reflection, to solitude. Inevitably, it's a very important internal journey. I don't recommend it to everyone, because to write poetry, you have to be very, very strong.
And within that strength, I suppose you have to have a method, a system, a formula. Not a writing formula, but a formula like those craftsmen who keep their workshop perfectly tidy. What are the forms which Kepa uses? How does he manage his notebooks? Does he use notebooks or a computer? How does he organise himself in all that disorder? Because you've written almost 20 books, some of them very thick.
And all those books, although all by Kepa Murua, where you can recognise the voice of one author, are different, with different nuances. The books are different. I work on the concept of a book of poems, but the books can be short or they can be more extensive. Short books call up emotions and immediate feeling, and longer books summon time, maturity. You could say that in longer books there is a much more rational literary apparatus, better thought out. But it doesn't have to be like that. Sometimes in long books too, there's an important backroom literary. Although they are different, I still write by hand in some notebooks, and am inevitably accompanied by a computer. But the time and the writing have to be the same. They have to submit, generally, to the rhythm of awareness. Just because you write on a computer or in pencil doesn't mean that you have to do it at a set pace, faster or slower. It must be a rhythm of mental awareness, of writing, and that can be supported by any medium. All you need is a pencil, a pen and a blank page, or it could be the blank screen of a computer. But in principle, to write poetry in this field, you have to look for an idea, you have to look for an approach, you have to look for sequences. We could transfer it to the field of music and talk as if it was a symphony, and if we went over to the field of cinema, we could say that it's a film, with its sequences, its shots, its rhythms.
It's discarded material, I suppose.
That's right, yes, a lot of discarded material. What isn't said when a book is published or read. Generally, the author doesn't talk about that discarded material, but one of the most important things in writing is the rewriting, the correction. One doesn't finish it just because. You finish it after rewriting it several times, when you've corrected it very well, and when finally all the pieces fit together.
Aquí algunos apuntes todavía, cuando hago lecturas, el tema del ritmo, las pausas.
O sea, que sigues revisando tus libros.
No,
después.
lo que pasa es que cuando me invitan a leer, la gente me pide. Me pide, por ejemplo, de este libro me piden Existiendo, ¿no? Entonces voy apuntando algunas pautas para leerlo con sentido y... Este es un libro muy erótico. Reconozco que me salió bien ese juego del paisaje y el erotismo y me salió bien y Mincho lo trasladó muy bien. Azul en tus ojos casi siempre. El silencio como el cielo disperso entre el color de 1000 manos. La tierra tenía la profundidad que alcanza la piedra en la arena. El tiempo guardaba aire en su boca por si algún día lo necesitases. Hoja en la superficie del agua, la memoria flotaba lentamente. El abismo crecía con la mirada si no se veía el horizonte a lo lejos. La curiosidad casi siempre, tus ojos algún día.
And speaking of music, we've talked about the music you listen to when you write. There's a part of your work, everyone knows the trilogy, China, Fleisch and Faber, but also poems of the Walker and all the illustrations which Mincho did. Apart from in that book, in the first works published by Calambur, why are you open to collaboration with other artists, photographers, painters and musicians?
Precisely to complete that silence, also to escape from that silence, which is very good for creation, and also to learn, to leave the isolation. Working with other artists means that you learn. You discover that you're not who you thought you were, and you learn just how others see you. You also learn from their gestures, their intuitions, their artistic knowledge, and their artistic language is different from yours. Then, in that mutual understanding, you two start adjusting your voice. You start listening to its opinions, and inevitably a communication develops. That communication is recommendable for all artists, especially for writers, and even more so for poets, because they leave their isolation and they give themselves over to the world with other hands, with sensitivity, and that learning is inevitable. One later, after learning or collaborating with musicians, painters, photographers, goes back to his solitude, but unavoidably he's forced to go out into the world through those languages.
Before, you said that as much as if one writes in pencil or by computer, it's the speed of awareness that marks the rhythm and that tells us that in the end the format counts. That is, the frame conditions the work.
Yes, and the language sometimes, yes.
And for example, what did you feel when you heard your poems sung by Tasio Miranda?
For me, it was very important, because I could come from having matured the ideas, like the relationship between short poem and long poem, and also the play between poetry and song. I felt satisfaction on the one hand and generosity, because singer-songwriters condense the poem. They want to cut it down. They want to underline a sort of chorus that they appear to see in the poem. But I also saw that that husky voice, that sound, fitted perfectly with the kind of poem chosen, and it gave it spaciousness. In fact, when a singer-songwriter notices a poet, those poems are amplified, extended to a certain number of readers or spectators, and it's a very interesting way of spreading poetry further than published books or writings.
Indeed, poetry and music, right back to the Greeks, were very united, and later the paths of culture have separated them.
Yeah, let's say that genres many times were invented by man to create a vision which is more didactic than real.
A veces es tu mirada mi único freno, algo que me recuerda que ni amo ni me aman.
And then there's another great relationship. We've talked about the relationship that Kepa has with other artists and the relationship he has with writing, how it's born. But then there's the relationship with the reader. You're a poet and a writer who isn't only shut inside his house but attends recitals, book fairs, signs copies. What's the good? What's the bad? What do you learn? Because in the end it's very important. What do you learn from the relationship with the reader?
You learn a lot, more than people think. Inevitably the relationship with the reader leads you to positions of humility which are wonderful. The reader, although he's not always right in what he says, is one of the best companions of the solitary writer, for the poet, because he says things, he tells him things, and also gives his opinion. It's not only through this relationship in book fairs, presentations, but with letters that you receive. One sees there a kind of very personal critique, very direct, where a spade is a spade, without great metaphors which can confuse you. And it's then that one sees the vision which transcends. And above all, the interpretation which people make of your own writings.
Which must be amazing.
Yes, it's surprising, it's magical. I've already said that they're not always right, but they also help you to understand what you are, what you represent for them, and unavoidably those letters very often encourage you to go on writing.
En China pues pasaba frío.
O sea, que el azul no es retoque.
No, jamás. Es la luz. Podía estar 4 o 5 horas para hasta acertar, ¿no? Congelado de frío. En Flis le pasa otras cosas, como bajaba los arrecifes agarrado por cuerdas, le podía pillar la ola. Pero, ¿ves? Mira, esto es una escultura en sí, zen. Es una foto de escultura. Los arrecifes, el rastro del Flis, el rastro del paso del tiempo, el brillo en la arena, el color de las rocas. el musgo. Y tiene una sensación también escultórica. Que claro, cuando te acercas y ves la foto sabes lo que es, pero esto te puede llevar por la imaginación a cualquier reflexión, ¿no? Y el último es el Faber, que también tiene cosas muy bonitas. Más modernas si cabe. Más modernas si cabe. Porque juega con el arte pobre, lo que el hombre deja en la naturaleza. Las construcciones de las autopistas, cómo van quedando en desuso. Las ruinas de las casas en medio de la naturaleza. Edificios que fueron importantes y luego no son nada. El mismo rastro de los montañeros para encontrar el camino. Fíjate, una casa derruida en medio del campo. Las maderas. Todo esto es un trabajo muy hermoso. Los agujeros que suelen dejar en la roca para excavar edificios y luego quedan en nada. Como elementos del land art, ¿no? Lo que se conoce como el arte del paisaje, ¿no? Y a eso pues inevitablemente otra vez el mismo juego, ¿no? Texto, poético, fotografía, ¿no? Es un trabajo importante, es el de trabajar con otro artista.
You said that you choose life, and there's part of your work in which there's a part of people's lives which is very important, which is space, and that in art is usually called landscape. There's a trilogy which we mentioned before, Ichina, Fleisch and Faber, which just talks about that, landscape. How important is it for you?
The landscape is important. One has to know where he lives, and the landscape positions us with certain humility as human beings, as people. The landscape in my poetry has a vision zen. It transcends reality itself. In the case of the trilogy Ichina, Fleisch and Faber, I blended a lyrical vision, a poetic prose along the lines of José María Álvarez's photographs, and in the end I realised I was talking about the solidity of the landscape against the fragility of the human being. They're poems with a very deep philosophical weight, very tender, and I think that they're poems still to be discovered, because people reject, I don't know why, poetic prose. But the simplicity of those poems, the existential achievement, and above all the voice, the lyrical voice, I think haven't yet been discovered, precisely because there's a complex labour which the reader will never see. That's a way of squeezing out the landscape as much as possible, and also showing that landscapes can also be made with literature.
It was moreover in that trilogy, I loved the first two volumes, and I was even lucky enough to write the introduction to one of them. But the third was the one which most surprised me, because suddenly the natural landscape no longer had the leading role, and this was taken over by the hand of man, the Latin faber, things broken, demolished, broken bridges, those walls which had fallen down.
The passage of time, the ruins, the defeats, all the important elements of my literature. Also in the form there's a structural change. In the first two books, both in Ichina and Fleisch, I came after the photographer. The photographer did the first spread, and then I placed the text and the empty spaces. But to close the trilogy, I asked José María Álvarez to let me mark the rhythm, to let me start and finish it, and also to let me choose the visual itinerary of those poems. That's why Faber contains a more accurate component, let's say, from the point of view of literary development. It opens and closes definitely. And there is a journey of man, a journey of the human being through death, life, love, hope, light, and above all, that playing with the landscape that Ichina and Fleisch have, but in a more diluted way.
Me gustan porque reflejan muy bien el sentido del libro, el sentido del paisaje urbano, la memoria, y luego porque tiene una magia un tanto onírica, ¿no? Juega con la realidad y los sueños, ¿no? Son figuras que se convierten en nubes, o nubes que se convierten en figuras. Me gusta cómo es capaz de cambiar la realidad y la irrealidad y reflejar con pocos trazos pues pequeñas pinceladas del paisaje urbano. Luego pequeños detalles de iglesias que remiten a la ciudad, ¿no? Estos son los arquillos, donde se reúnen los inmigrantes. La historia generalmente recopila muchos documentos, como pues la fotografía, los documentales, el cine, pero también la literatura. Y luego recupera como complemento documentos de la ficción, de la imaginación, que muchas veces son metáforas de la misma realidad. Al final uno no va a la misma realidad, sino que va igual a una película distorsionada, que es metáfora, o una pintura, ¿no? Y es esto lo que intentamos reflejar Mincho y yo, al andarnos un poco al paso del tiempo y a través de la literatura hacer pues una especie de ciudad moderna que cada día se está convirtiendo más Vitoria-Gasteiz, ¿no? Entonces él distorsiona la realidad desde la misma portada. Si os fijáis, en la misma portada, bueno, esta es la estación de tren, pero en la misma portada, que es otro dibujo, aparece un río en el medio de la estación de tren.
You did well, along with Mincho, a beautiful book, in my opinion. I was born in Vitoria, about the town of Vitoria. Poems of the Walker is its title, with some beautiful paintings by Mincho. What did you see? The Walker. What is it for you, the Walker?
It's a metaphor beyond a town like Vitoria, although it is also a homage to the town where I live. It refers to a town which takes in the immigrant. That's the dilemma between the passerby and the walker. The passerby would be the man from the town, and the walker is the man of the road who arrives in the town. It's that symbiosis between tradition and modernity, between the native and the immigrant, and above all, it's a book written to be understood by a 10-year-old child and a gentleman older than 80. With poems which are apparently simple and very heartfelt, which speak a bit about the significance of creating a town among all of us, which in the end is also an added metaphor of what poetry is.
A space of reconciliation among everyone.
Yes, among everyone, all the poets, all the readers, each with a vision, each with a way of understanding the world, but valid for everyone.
También el ensayo de la poesía, si es que existe. Luego libros de poemas muy emblemáticos, pues, como Un lugar por nosotros, en diferentes ediciones, en diferentes editoriales también. Libros de aforismos. Y luego están los libros de El no es nada, Carriolemas, Las manos en alto. Esto ya es poesía. Y lo último que publiqué, Poesía sola, pura premonición, un libro que ya es un mamotreto muy grande. También está Cantos del Dios Oscuro. También os puedo enseñar pruebas de un libro que voy a publicar ahora. Entonces este es un libro que voy a publicar ahora y son las terceras pruebas. Con el poema Mi madre. Esto es el libro antes de llevarlo a la imprenta. Lo que es la maquetación, el diseño.
Y ese también lo vas a
publicar.
Lo vas a publicar también.
Sí, estos son los temas de mi divorcio. Aquí puede haber unos datos míos, cuando recibo las pruebas, cuando lo he corregido, cosas por el estilo.
¿Y eso lo publicarás también con fotos o
No, esto va con calambur. Con una portada de Mincho, con la del gato negro, ¿no? Esto es el libro como tal. Y aquí tengo pues los manuscritos, los libros, unos manuscritos inéditos, la biblioteca.
If you agree, and today, seeing as I have the chance, I'd like, as one of your long-time readers, along the lines of the titles of your poetic works, to tell me as if this was a free jazz concert, the first solo you think of, in whatever key you want and whatever tempo you prefer.
And whatever length.
And whatever length you want.
Okay.
I always counted to 10 and you never appeared.
I was on the point of changing the title at the last minute. It's a good job I didn't. This is the book which opened me up to an audience. From the periphery, it opened me up to an important audience. It's a book which is now in its 5th edition. It's been translated into other languages, and it's the book which people often ask me to recite. I think it's the book which gave me considerable strength and made me trust in what I was writing. Because although it was published almost in the year 2000, it was a book which I'd been maturing, despite its shortness, for a few years before. The truth is, I'm very grateful to Calembour for publishing this book, and above all for the results it achieved. I remember that there weren't many reviews, and the most important media of the time hardly mentioned it. But an important drip started, and the readers seized on it. And it allowed me, overnight, to make a name for myself in the field of the arts and poetry.
5 editions in poetry.
Yes, and also translation into other languages, which opened doors for me in other countries, which is always important.
Digging the earth with your dreams.
This is an intimate book. I like the title because it talks about that. It talks about unreality. And the poet sees himself as a farmer who digs the earth. There's an erotic part, also important. There's a devastating society with violence, because there are some landscapes which refer to what is happening and used to happen more so, if that's possible, in the Basque Country. There are some poems which are still difficult for me to read in public.
A place for us.
Before a place for us, I'd like to talk about cardio slogans, because I always counted to 10 and you never appeared, Digging the Earth with Your Dreams, and cardio slogans form part of a trilogy. With cardio slogans, the critics said, with this book, Kepa Murua reached maturity, and I laughed because it was the first one I wrote of that trilogy. The truth is, they were published indistinctly. They were published in reverse order, but Cardio Slogans was a book which I wrote when I was young. Only I guessed that at that time the public and also the publishing world weren't ready to accept a book of those characteristics. And in fact, I still think it's a book which will be discovered in the future. It was written in a trance, a poetic trance, while I was living in Freiburg. When I was crossing the bridge, the name came to me. The title, Cardio Slogans, came to me, but I know why it did. Because before I went to Germany, I tore up, because of my publishing failures, I tore up many poems and thought about giving it all up. And when I thought about abandoning poetry, or thought that poetry had abandoned me, in Freiburg I began in a restless way to write a poem every day. I remember how the first title came to me, Cardio Slogans, then I remember Delay, some very interesting poems. When I read it, the truth is that they also make my hair stand on end.
A year after Cardio Slogans, Poetry and You comes out.
Yes, Poetry and You are some very refined aphorisms in which I talk about death, a subject which at that time and still today is difficult to work, from the field of literature or thought. And it talks a bit about love, about defeat, about violence, and about the first babblings about why I write.
And about God.
Also about God, a subject which has interested me. Religion interests me as a man, as a citizen, and I often wonder. And in those aphorisms there's a formal refinement, but its publication was also risky because at that time young poets didn't publish, or they didn't have the opportunity to publish books about thoughts about aphorism. Nowadays it's much more frequent, but with Poetry and You, I think I opened a door to that type of genre, above all to see that the poet or poetry is accompanied by a kind of literature, which many times is defined as inferior and that for me is all the same.
Hands Up.
Hands Up has very tender poems. Some are very narrative and long. Let's say there I'm looking for a kind of poetic justice. When I wrote it, the world was devastating, just like now. With wars, there was the problem of the old Yugoslavia, and the truth is that the pictures in the media were dramatic. Then, from the solitude of the poet, one becomes an expressive figure and starts opening up to his hands, which in a way symbolise that contrast. Hands up when you're going to be mugged or shot, and on the contrary, those hand gestures, from thumping a table to shaking someone's hand or hugging them or caressing them. There starts to be a stroke of tenderness, which is inevitable in my books, because one of my female readers, who had also followed me for a long time, said to me once, "Kepa Murua, I really like your books, but sometimes they lack certain tenderness." I thought, what rubbish she's just said. But later I went back and thought it over and said, maybe she's right. I think that at that time I was in need of tenderness and I went looking for it through words.
A beautiful book. Blue Songs of the Dark God.
A devastating book. A different book. A devastating book. It reminds me of my son Jürgen. With this book, I think a lot about my son, a lot, because I thought, how am I going to explain this book to my son one day? And look how time has passed, and I think I have explained it to him, although I don't know if he's taken any notice of me. And then there's, of course, A Place for Us, another devastating book. But that one helped me to explain the violence in the Basque Country. With that book, a strange thing happened to me. People who had always said hello to me stopped doing it, and people who had never said hello to me before started doing it. And I went, you've done something different. You've done something very strange, and I know why. Because I wanted to explain the problem of terrorism. Although I was talking about the Basque Country, it could transcend to any part of the world. Because it's a book which can be understood by a reader in New York, a reader in Madrid, or in San Sebastian. And there are some narrative poems here, because to explain myself, to explain that fact of terrorist violence or domestic violence, I needed a more narrative poetry. And there I started to tell things, there I let loose. In there as well also appear the self-portraits. There are love poems, but also a lot of coldness. It was a difficult book, a very hard book of poems, and I remember it sold out in 3 months.
And it was re-edited.
Yes, and it's still being re-edited.
And after those titles, some of them so long, It's Nothing.
It's Nothing is a more tender book of poems, where I give voice to the dead. I also give voice to those who don't have words. And I speak a bit about love and loss of love. The landscape of It's Nothing is the sea, the blue sea. The colour of It's Nothing is blue. And I also really like the title, because it's a way of looking at yourself in the mirror and saying, it's nothing, Kepa Murua, carry on. The mistakes we make, the misunderstandings we cause, and we forgive ourselves, or we laugh and say, another new opportunity, for love, for life, for work, for everything.
And the thick volume of single poetry, Pure Premonition.
It's 20 years of writing. The first poem I wrote when I was living in Berlin in 1989, when the Berlin Wall came down, and the last I think I wrote in 2009. The correction process was also very hard. I would get up every day almost at 4 o'clock in the morning to be able to correct them, because there are more than 700 poems. There were 20 notebooks, 13 or 14 notebooks, and later they were reduced, but the poetic work is wonderful. It's like a symphony. There, I think at the beginning I suffered for what I'd written, but once I was able to organise the book and start working on it, then I had a good time. I enjoyed the craftsmanship of writing. I like that book a lot. There are black places and passages, but also inevitably there are moments of extreme clarity and a lot of light.
And the black cat of love.
I talked about the black cat earlier. There's a poem which I like a lot called My Tiny Heart. My Tiny Heart because I, at that time, in the midst of losing love, felt incapable of writing love poems. And then life showed me just the opposite. But well, I'm happy. Just as in that moment I was suffering because of what I was writing, now when I've corrected it, I've laughed quite a lot. I've laughed a lot. It's also about that. Many times poetry should be like balm, not only for the reader, but also for the writer himself.
Well, thank you for writing so well, and for writing so much.
Thank you to you, Pedro.